Good morning, children. Now we are going to go into the third part of this lesson, that is economy and occupations. Now, in the previous session, we had studied about private and public sectors. We had also studied about the GNP and GDP of an economy. Okay, now here let us now learn what an economic activity is. Economic activity is the activity of making, providing, purchasing, or selling goods or services. Any action that involves producing, distributing, or consuming products or services is an economic activity. So, what is an economic activity? Now, it involves making, then providing, even buying, selling of goods and services, and which also involves, say, production, distribution, or consumption of these goods and services. Okay, now economic activity can be divided into four parts, okay, based on occupation. Now, what is a primary activity? So, under occupation, we can divide economic activities based on occupation as primary, secondary, tertiary, and even quaternary occupations. So, what is a primary activity or occupation? Now, they are directly dependent upon nature, that is, the environment, and it refers to the utilization of the earth's resources. So, earth's resources here involves land, water, okay, vegetation, then materials, building materials, minerals, ores, etc. So, activities like, say, farming or agriculture, then we have logging, hunting, fishing, mining, then fruit collection, okay, all these are involved in the primary sector. Okay, now if you take the developing countries of the world, we find a larger proportion of the population is engaged in the primary sector. But when you compare it with the developed countries of the world, we find very few percentage, a very small amount of the population will be involved in the primary activity. Now, if you take India, for example, we have 48% of India's population which is involved in primary activities. And in Brazil, you find only about 10% of the population is engaged in the primary sector. Now, primary activities of the primary sector is workers are also called as red collar workers because of the outdoor nature of their work. Now, this is a primary activity. Okay, this is beekeeping. Okay, so from which we can, honey is produced. So, production of honey is a primary activity. Now, this picture here you can see is that of mining. Okay, there's a huge hole which is being dug on the earth for the extraction of the minerals from the earth's surface. Okay, now here we have agricultural activity. Okay, in other words, we can say this is actually the harvest time. Okay, so harvesting is being carried out. So this is an agricultural activity, which in other words, it's a primary one. Okay, now next we come to secondary activities. Okay, secondary activities add value to natural resources by transforming raw materials into valuable products. So now you find most of the, if you take agricultural commodities for example, you find many of them are perishable. Okay, so if you are able to transform it, okay, these perishable activities have to be preserved. Okay, so activities like, say, papad making, then pickles, okay, all these are secondary activities. So the raw materials are transformed into valuable products. So secondary activities are therefore concerned with manufacturing, processing, and construction industries. Okay, so all production conversion of milk into milk powders. Okay, then cheese, production of cheese, papad, then you have pickles. Okay, all these come under the secondary occupation. In India, we find 24.3% of India's population is engaged in secondary occupation, while in Brazil, only 9% of the population is engaged in secondary activities. Secondary activities, those are, in other words, workers who are involved in secondary activities are called as blue collar workers. Next is the tertiary occupation. Now, in tertiary occupation, both production as well as exchange is included. Okay, now materials are produced. Okay, the raw materials which we obtain from the primary sector or activities is converted into secondary products. Okay, now these have to be sent, or in other words, we will have to sell the products. Okay, so you need to sell it, uh, so you need a market. Okay, you require transport, communication, services, etc. Okay, so tertiary activities include both production as well as exchange. So whatever materials are being produced, they have to be consumed. So for consumption, it requires the involvement of trade, transport, communication, etc. So all these activities are included in the tertiary activities. Now, tertiary activities are also called white collar jobs. In India, 26.9% of the population is engaged in tertiary activities. But in Brazil, 71% of the population is engaged in tertiary activities. Okay. Now, this is rope making, okay, industry. So this is secondary occupation. Next we come to quaternary activities. Now, a further more specialized tertiary activity is a quaternary activity. Now, quaternary activities are also called the knowledge sector. So those people who work in offices, buildings, elementary schools, that is teachers, then professors who work in universities, doctors, then those who work in the hospitals, in accounting, okay, chartered accountants, etc., all belong to quaternary activities or quaternary occupations. Okay, now just as tertiary functions can be outsourced, quaternary activities can also be outsourced. You'll be able to understand. I think you would have understood the meaning of outsourcing during this time. Okay, during this lockdown period, I think you would have understood what outsourcing is. Okay, they are not tied to resources. Okay, so these quaternary activities are not directly connected with resources. Okay, in other words, they're not affected by the environment, or say necessarily localized by the market. Okay, so you can sit and you can carry out your activities. Okay, so in other words, quaternary activities can be outsourced. Okay, so like the primary or even the secondary occupation, they are not tied to resources. They're not affected by the environment. For example, agricultural activity, for example, if there's too much of rain or even sunlight, you find the harvest gets destroyed. Okay, and also you need to have a market in the case of perishable commodities. Okay, on the other hand, quaternary activities do not are not affected by these by these activities or sources. Okay, now this is a school. Okay, in other words, this is here this is a quaternary activity. Now, here are certain activities which are given, and we are going to classify it under primary, secondary, or tertiary activities. Okay, so television and broadcasting, it is a tertiary activity. Beekeeping, is directly connected with nature, so it's a primary activity. Coir and rope making. Okay, now coir and rope making is a secondary activity. Okay, then jaggery making. Jaggery making again is a secondary activity, producing blades of the plow. So it's again a secondary activity. What about construction? Okay, construction is a tertiary activity. You need, you know, knowledge of construction. Okay, so it's a tertiary activity. Extraction of iron ore, so that's a primary activity. Automobile production, secondary. Then rice production is a primary activity. Then teaching is a tertiary activity. Driving buses is tertiary activity. Providing lodging and boarding facilities again comes under tourism. So it's a tertiary activity. So I think you would have understood what primary, secondary and tertiary activities are. Okay. Now let's come to this diagram. This is a pie diagram. Okay. The first one will show you the contribution of sectors, of these various sectors to the GDP. Okay. Now, first let us see the first pie diagram that shows Brazil and India. Here, this shows the contribution of Brazil to the GDP in the year 2016. This shows the contribution of India to GDP in the year 2016. Okay. Now, the blue color here shows that this is a primary, okay, sector. The primary sector contributes about 5.5% to the GDP in the year 2016 in the case of Brazil. Then this orange one is a secondary sector. In Brazil, 27.5% of the population, 27.5% is contributed to GDP by the secondary sector. And last of all, the tertiary sector contributes about 67% to the GDP. What about India? Now, the primary sector contributes about 17% to GDP. Compare that with India. Okay. Compare that with Brazil. In India, it is 17, but in Brazil, we find it is 5.5. In India, again, the secondary sector contributes 26% to GDP. In Brazil, it is 27.5. What about the tertiary sector? In India, the tertiary sector contributes about 57% to the GDP, while in Brazil, it is 67%. Now, let's come to the second diagram. Okay, the second diagram shows the percentage of population engaged in various sectors. Okay, here in Brazil, 10% of the population is engaged in agriculture and allied activities. Then, secondary sector contributes about 19% of the population and the tertiary sector about 71%. How about in India? Now, in India, you find 48.8% of the population is engaged in primary activities, that's agriculture and allied activities. Then 24.3% of the population is engaged in secondary activities and 26.9% of the population is engaged in tertiary activities. This is according to 2016. Okay. Now, let's come to the question. So, here are some questions and we are going to look into the pie diagram and then answer these. Which country has a higher percentage of population engaged in primary activities? So, compare that now primary activity. So, whether it is India or Brazil. We know it is India. Okay. So, 48.8% of the population is engaged in agriculture, or in other words, primary activity, that is in India. In which country is the contribution of tertiary sector greater in GDP? Okay, tertiary sector. So, GDP. So, contribution of GDP here is more in the case of Brazil, that's the tertiary sector. than in India. Okay, so Brazil contributes greater portion of the tertiary sector to GDP. In which country is the share of secondary activities more in GDP? So secondary activities. So here in Brazil, okay, this is 27.5. India, it is 26. So again, it is Brazil. So share of secondary activity to GDP is more in the case of Brazil. Can we say that Brazil is an agrarian economy like India? Give reasons. So what is an agrarian economy? An economy in which, the activity consists of agriculture and allied activity. So let's come to this. Now look at this. Primary activities concerned with agrarian economy. Okay. Now here you find 10% of the population is engaged in agriculture. Okay. But in India, you find 48.8% is concerned with agriculture and allied activities. But look at this. You have 71% of the population engaged in tertiary activities. But here in India, it is only 26.9. Okay. So, is Brazil an agrarian economy? No. Because we find 71% of the population is engaged in tertiary activities. Okay. And its GDP is 67%. Now, therefore, we find, so look at GDP. So GDP contribution of tertiary sector to GDP is 67. So you can't call Brazil an agrarian economy. Okay. And also you find the service sector, the tertiary sector is growing very fast in Brazil when you compare that with India. In India, the percentage is still very, very small. Okay. So children, I hope you have understood what primary, secondary and tertiary activities as well as quaternary activities are. Okay, we'll continue with this lesson in the next session. Till then, thank you.